Taking a deep breath in. Once again, coming into this beautiful moment, we breathe in peace, we exhale love. So it is. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So today's sermon is actually going to be building off of a little bit about what I introduced last week. And I'm shifting what I talked about last week just at the end slightly around, which was the elements that we mentioned. And so for those of you who might not have been here or have not listened to the talk yet, you're not missing anything because I'm going to be recapping it and we're just going to be extrapolating it. And so today is going to be titled most likely, but this is what I have on the paper so far, Elemental Focus, Daily Ritual of Transmutation. And so we're going to be, especially near the end or the second half of the sermon, we're going to be talking about how we can utilize the wisdom and the symbology of the elements to help us transmute, quote, negative energies. And really another word for negative is just the separating energies within ourselves, within our life, and then unify it in a way that can really bring about not only inner change, but also positive outer change. And so this is definitely a wonderful time to do these rituals every day with everything going on in the world. But first things first is transmutation is a word I use a lot in my next book that I'm writing, Living Earth. And transmutation, I think all of you, at least here in this, most of you in this room have heard me talk about it before, but we just keep building upon it. Transmutation is the idea of taking one type of energy and transforming it into another kind of energy. And so what I wrote down for today, and you can put this down underneath tangible transmutation, is thought form into physical reality. So we're taking thought form into physical reality. And so how often do we just have ideas about things, but we're not really acting upon them, or we're not really seeing that type of change? And so this is where transmutation really comes into effect. And so we're going to start, let's see, how do we want to begin? Because there is so much here. Let's take a breath real quick. Okay, let's go ahead and actually start on the right side of the page where it has the 4 elements. And so we're going to go ahead and fill in the blanks. And for those of you, I'm going to be posting this little handout on our Dunisha Sanctuary online group for anyone if you want to fill it in, or you can just take notes. So the element of air represents, the first little underline is east. It is the direction of east. The element of fire is the direction of south. The element of water is west. And the element of earth is north. Continuing from air, we have state of mind next to east. Continuing from fire next to south, we have actions and behavior. Next to water and west, we have emotionality. And next to earth, you have north, which is root ideologies. Root ideologies. And so some of you, depending on what tradition you come from, or if you've been in the spiritual circles, maybe you have heard of these before. We used to, and we will in the future, but we used to always do full moon rituals, and we would activate the 4 directions. And the 4 directions might have different symbology depending on the tradition, but this is the tradition that we have followed in Dunisha. And what's interesting is when you recognize, when you take a moment in sacred space, which we're going to explain more later, but when you recognize the 4 directions, what's fascinating is it's almost like you're creating a sacred space right here in the now. And so you're recognizing the east, the air, the fire, the south, the west, the water, and then the north and the earth. So you're activating the 4 directions of life, you're activating the 4 elements of life, and you're coming into this beautiful moment. And if any of you've done rituals with this, or maybe you've done rituals yourself, it's almost like you feel like that feeling when you're going in an airplane and it's that change in elevation. There's like a shift in energy in the room. And I like to kind of explain that as it's really not anything mystical, even though it feels mystical. It's really just entering into this present moment. And it's so fascinating that just, I guess you could call it, you're tapped in, tuned in, turned on, as Abraham Hicks would say. And it's a really beautiful feeling, and it's a beautiful moment that we can really activate the energies of transmutation. And so now let's switch back to the left side of the page. Because we have intangible transmutation, we're going to go ahead and next write down and we're going to write down the word paradox. Paradox dash self as the center of everything. And this is where we're going to start talking about our psychology. So paradox dash self as the center of everything. So most of us live our lives as the center of the universe. And that's not meaning narcissism at all. It's just we can't freaking help it. We are experiencing and perceiving life through our 5, 6, 7, 8, depending on, again, which psychology tradition you come from, our senses. And so we literally cannot help but perceive our life as the center of the universe, because our consciousness is being filtered, or the information from life is being filtered through this physical body, through this mental consciousness. Does that make sense? Through the emotionality. And although we can't change that we're experiencing reality through our own being, we can at least recognize the, I guess, quote, negative components of being the center of the universe, and how we might lack empathy, we might lack understanding, we might take things so personally, and we forget that there's so much more to life than just this singular moment where we're losing our shit over just that's impacting us. Does that make sense? And so what I love about the 4 elements, this is what the paradox, when you call in the 4 directions, which is really beautiful because it's like, no matter where you go, the 4 directions are always there. Isn't that interesting? So you can create sacred space anywhere you go. So if I go a little bit over here, I might be going a little bit more west, but there's still, in each direction of me, there's the 4 components, and I can move in any way I want. But there's also the 4 elements always within my body, so I can always connect in with this expansiveness of life, which I love the 4 directions because it reminds us how expansive this life is. And then the 4 elements remind us how humble we are, because we are a combination of elements that's making this physical being and this consciousness possible. Does that make sense? And so, self as the center of everything. We are the center of our experienced reality. And that's another way of saying that. We are the center of our experienced reality. And when we enter into the sacred space of the 4 elements and directions, what we're doing in this, you can put a little star next to it, is we enter in to step out. We enter in to step out. By entering in the sacred space of the present moment, of recognizing the 4 directions and the 4 elements, we're also able to step outside of ourselves in that moment of time. Because although we cannot ever fully not see life through our own experienced lens, our own biased lens, we can at least soften it, which you'll see the ritual later on, how it does soften it. But it reminds us of our... This is what's so funny. I mean, so much self-help out there is like, remind yourself of your greatness. And I'm like, remind yourself of your foolishness. Remind yourself of your insignificance. Because a lot of our issues is we are overhyping our attachment to our identity, and that's why we suffer. Who's done that before? Again, any form of our identity, even our ideologies, we attach ourselves to them so much. And we are making such a big deal about them that it then ends up hurting ourselves, hurting our family, hurting other people, because we're projecting our ideologies, rather than recognizing I am just one small component in this cog, this wheel, the cog of the wheel. There we go. And so I'm really big on releasing that identity. And then one more thing, and then we'll be done with the tangible transmutation, at least for now. You can write down, dissolving our disillusioned state of identity. Dissolving our disillusioned state of identity. And boy, howdy, I could spend a whole hour just talking about that, but we'll keep this engine moving. But dissolving the disillusioned state of our identity. And that again links back to, we enter into the sacred space so that we can step out of it and see things more clearly. Gosh, I love that. So now I'm gonna jump down to the bottom of the right side of the page where it says just for today. And this is gonna be the ritual component that I'm gonna invite all of us to practice this week. And I'll come back to, if you wanna get a little more tangible with tools, physical things you can use on your altar, but even just saying this vow, these 4 vows every single day, it will benefit your life because you are actualizing your consciousness and transmuting that energy into physicality during the day. Using a lot of weird words, but that's okay. Okay, so just for today, and I'll explain the wisdom of saying just for today soon, but just for today, I vow to transmute thoughts of judgment into compassion and understanding. So the first fill in the blank is compassion and understanding. I vow to transmute thoughts of judgment into compassion and understanding. Next, I vow to transmute aggressive and hasty behavior into mindful grace and dignity. I vow to transmute aggressive and hasty behavior into mindful grace and dignity. The third one is, I vow to transmute emotional distress into tranquility and equilibrium. Tranquility and equilibrium. And the final one, I vow to transmute dogmatic rigidness into acceptance and flexibility. Acceptance and flexibility. And if you want, because last week we talked about, you can put parentheses freshness. Flexibility. Freshness. So let's go ahead and break this down. So we start by saying just for today, because when we make a vow, it's a pretty big deal. And we never want anyone to feel like when you say these vows, you're like, well, that's it, I'm pigeonholed. And if I react out of blah, blah, blah in the future, that I'm gonna have guilt or whatnot. We don't even wanna worry about that. We're worrying about just for today, because how many people have made these huge commitments and then you change in a year or 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. And you feel, I don't know, there's that feeling of, I can't even think of the word right now, but it's not in resonance. And we, again, in Dunisha, we never want to create that feeling. And so we simply, and also we're not worrying about the future so much because we recognize that what we do today lays the groundwork for the future. And so we're not going to have people think of like your vow of being a vegan for 30 more years. That's going to be very overwhelming. But if you say, I'm just going to choose not to eat meat today, you see how much softer that is? Exactly. And so just focusing on today with being compassionate and understanding is much easier than saying, I'm focusing on being compassionate and understanding for the rest of my life. It almost is impossible because it gets overwhelming. But if you do it every single day, just for today, you naturally are embracing it. So that's the wisdom of just for today. So obviously thoughts of judgment into compassion and understanding make sense, right? Judgment is another form of ignorance. Anytime we're in judgment, we literally are being ignorant because we are just focusing on one bit of someone or something, and we're not allowing the fullness of the experienced reality to enter into our being, which most of the time it really cannot. So when in doubt, if you're in judgment, dissolve that ignorance into dissolve the ignorance through compassion, and understanding will naturally follow. In Living Peace, I also talk about the word gentle curiosity and how we can activate gentle curiosity so that even when we're experiencing and witnessing really tragic and violent and triggering things out in the world, we can still cultivate these qualities. Because it's these qualities that actually lead to the changing of society. At least in the direction that would be more peaceful. So the second one is I vow to transmute aggressive and hasty behavior into mindful grace and dignity. Who sometimes rushes? Who's ever rushed before? And in your rush, you fucked things up, right? My goodness. I remember one, it's like the silliness of even rushing in the morning, and then you stub your toe and then you scream or something, and then you're doing the toothpaste and then it gets on you because just through your own haste, you are being mindless, and in your mindlessness, you're faltering, you're tripping over yourself. And then what ends up happening is you trip over your words. If you've ever had a hasty morning and then your loved one says goodbye or says good morning, and then you speak in a tone just because of your haste, and you think you just gotta shut that shit down and then get out that door, it's very violent. And so we must also look at hastiness as a form of violence, and recognizing that we can still be swift. So if you want to be swift, we'll look at that as the positive manifestation of hastiness, while hastiness is the, quote, negative separation that can create that feeling of separation in the moment, where we can still be brisk and swift. Certain monasteries with Buddhist monks, they have to book it to place. They actually, when the bell rings, they have to get up and quickly dart to the next location. And so there's a swift, brisk walk that they're doing. They're not always just taking their damn time. And so you can still be very mindful in your briskness. Does that make sense? And so that's just a beautiful way to transmute that energy of aggressiveness that manifests in our haste. And gosh, I just love mindful grace. Who here would say that you're a graceful being? It's not something a lot of people, actualize with. And when we say grace, I think a stereotype we might think is like a dancer or a ballerina, someone who's graceful on their feet. But I'm not even talking about that in the slightest. Anyone could be graceful. I'm simply talking about that when we are mindful with what we do, there is a natural grace that manifests from it. Even just going and picking up a tissue, if we're picking it up mindfully, there is a gracefulness to it. When we are walking, there could be a gracefulness to it. When we are cleaning, there could be a gracefulness to it. Grace is just another way of saying, bringing presence into the moment with what you're doing. Ooh, that's a beautiful quote. Write that shit down if you want. You don't have to, but grace is just bringing mindfulness of presence into the moment, or the presence of mindfulness into the moment. Oh my gosh, we're already 18 minutes in and I'm only halfway through. I will have to cut this short. Okay, we'll at least finish this. And then of course we transmute our emotional distress into tranquility and equilibrium. That is the entirety of Living Peace. All the teachings and the 9 tenets that we are actualizing in our being helps us transmute emotional distress of our lives into tranquility and equilibrium through mastery of thought, mastery of impulse, mastery of emotion, seeing beyond the illusion of ignorance and transforming it into understanding, beyond the illusion of chaos, transforming it into harmony, and transforming the ignorance of duality and transforming it into transcendence, and releasing our attachment to the mundane, our knowing, and our self. Those 9 teachings help us with our emotional distress so that we can then transmute it into peace. And finally, dogmatic rigidness is often based in ideologies that might make us stale, that might make us stagnant, that keep us in our stubbornness. And that's why we invite in acceptance and flexibility. Acceptance is not condoning. It's literally just accepting that this is how things are now. And we have to be okay with change. Otherwise, we're going to freaking suffer. And so that's where we have that flexibility in. Anytime we're in dogmatic resistance, it causes a lot of emotional harm to ourselves. Who's resisted someone before? I'm not even talking about like these big movements, political or religious. I'm talking about people that piss you off in everyday life. Anyone can relate, right? And have you noticed when you resist them in your mind, it hurts? Like when you're judging them and resisting them in your mind, you're like, I wish they weren't that way. Even saying that sentence is harmful to your own psyche because you're not accepting the reality as the reality. You know, it's saying, okay, this person's a scorpion, I accept that they're a scorpion. I'm gonna treat them as a scorpion now. Not with like violence, as some people might, but with distance. I'm not gonna just go over and pick it up and be like, why did it sting me? No, you're gonna say, okay, I recognize that it has a stinger and I'm going to act accordingly now, and I'm gonna stop pretending it's a fluffy bunny. A lot of times people get so hurt over people because they're pretending them to be different than who they are. I'm thinking of all the times I've done relationship coaching. How many people have fallen in love with potential all the while not accepting the person for who they really are? Because here's the issue, when you accept people for who they truly are, sometimes you might break up. But you don't want to break up because you're holding on to an ideology of what a relationship or your future or a marriage should look like. And so you are and a lot of people are in deep denial of things. But if they fully accepted it from day one, they would have never gone down the crazy train, if that makes sense. But even if you do, it's not bad or wrong, it's just causing resistance, it's just causing suffering. But even if you got a one-way trip, and you choose to stay on that train and the destination that it brought you, you can still cultivate peace in the moment by accepting the people as they are now. Does that make sense? Isn't that beautiful? It's challenging, but there's so much flexibility that we have in our lives that we don't realize, even if we feel trapped. And that flexibility stems from the acceptance of the mind or the resistance of the mind. Ooh, that was some good shit. Pause it, go back, listen 3 more times, because that's something almost all of us struggle with. Let's take a breath. So let's move on to the middle part of the second page, which is elemental representations. Any of you have seen any magic or witchy show or whatnot? These might seem familiar because they take inspiration from these spiritual traditions. And so air, you're going to write down next to air is a feather or incense. Feather or incense. Fire, you'll write down candle. Water will be chalice, or you can literally just put cup, but I feel like chalice is prettier. Obviously the chalice would have water in it. And then earth is a stone or crystal. And so when you have an altar in front of you and you place incense to the east, you put a candle to the south, chalice with water to the west, and a stone or crystal to the north. When you are invoking just for today, you can touch each of the elements. And when you're touching each of the elements, you are actualizing that wisdom, that energy within you. You are making it more real, if you will. Because there's definitely something to be said when you see something that has a representation and you're holding it, it changes things. I think about how Christians might have a cross, and when they pray, they may touch the cross, right? So they are physically touching something tangible, and they're seeing something that triggers within them the grace of the Holy Spirit and their connection to the divine, right? You know, that's nothing to take for granted. And so every religion, every spiritual path has something like that. And this, if you have an altar space and you have the 4 elements represented, my intention and my hope would be when you look at it every single day, you're like, yes, here's the sacred space that I can invoke in my life. And then I remember what each of the 4 elements represent, and I can invoke them in this minute. So just for today, I transmute thoughts of judgment into compassion and understanding. Just for today, I transmute ... Just for today, I transmute ... So contemplate for a moment, what would it look like if we thought about this every single day and started our mornings with this meditation and this ritual? It might change the way our stream of consciousness shows up in the world. It might change the way we transmute our thought forms that might be discombobulated into physical reality. Does that make sense? And so I invite you, even if maybe the sermon you're like, I didn't really fully resonate with it, but that's okay. It was still fun. I invite you to at least give it a try. And if you don't have a ritual, if you don't have an altar space or the 4 elements, at least say this mantra of just for today, every single day this week at the morning. And maybe before bed too. And just notice how, I promise, maybe even if you say it 3 times in the morning, you are going to notice during the day when you get triggered. And you're gonna reflect and be like, oh shit, I did that this morning. What is it supposed to be? And it's gonna create that pause, and then it can lead to a different response. The number one thing we're looking for is to eliminate mindlessness. Mindlessness. That thing. And this is a wonderful way in how to do it. And when we do our new moon and full moon rituals, or our solstice and equinox rituals, this is the foundation that will just extrapolate and make much bigger. Because again, we want to invoke the 4 directions. We want to invoke the 4 elements, how each of them represents a component of our psyche. Very nice. Let's take a breath. I have much more to go into, but we were not going to make this an hour-long talk, so we'll go ahead and end there. This could be a wonderful long workshop, which maybe I will do in the future. Breathing in, letting go. We enter into the sacred space so that we can then step outside of ourselves, outside of our ideologies, step outside of our egoic projections, step outside of our emotional attachments, and see things more clearly. Deep breath in. So it is. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, thank all the YouTubers and folks watching for joining in. I will be posting links down below if anyone wants to join our Dunisha Sanctuary online group, for these handouts every week, and our live meditations that we sometimes do. And links are below as well if anyone would like to donate. Thank you.